The morning sun cast long shadows across the military training compound as Lieutenant Sarah Chen adjusted her tactical gear one final time. The advanced survival course at Fort Henderson was known for pushing elite soldiers to their absolute limits, and today marked the beginning of the most challenging phase yet. Sarah had volunteered for this intensive program, one of only 12 soldiers selected from hundreds of applicants across multiple military branches. Her husband, Captain Marcus Chen, had kissed her goodbye that morning before heading to his own assignment with the helicopter squadron. They rarely served together, but this week was different. Marcus would be participating in the aerial support component of the same training exercise, though neither knew exactly how their paths might cross during the grueling 5-day simulation. The exercise was designed to test soldiers in extreme scenarios they might face in real combat situations. Participants would be divided into small teams and dropped into the wilderness surrounding the base, armed with minimal supplies and tasked with completing increasingly difficult objectives while evading capture by opposing forces played by seasoned instructors. Sarah's team consisted of herself and 2 other specialists. Sergeant Jake Rodriguez, a communications expert with 3 tours under his belt, and Corporal Lisa Park, a medic whose quick thinking had saved countless lives during her deployment in overseas operations. The 3 had trained together for weeks, building the kind of trust that could mean the difference between success and failure in real combat. As they gathered for the final briefing, Master Sergeant Williams, a grizzled veteran with over 20 years of experience, addressed the assembled participants. His voice carried the weight of authority as he outlined the rules of engagement for the exercise. Each team would be given coordinates for their insertion point, after which they would need to navigate through dense forest terrain while avoiding capture teams and completing specific mission objectives. The first objective seemed straightforward enough. Establish a secure communications link with base camp within 6 hours of insertion. However, Sarah knew from experience that nothing in military training was ever as simple as it appeared. The instructors had a reputation for throwing unexpected complications into every scenario. The helicopter ride to the insertion point took 45 minutes, during which Sarah's team reviewed their maps and equipment one final time. Through the aircraft's windows, she could see the sprawling wilderness that would serve as their testing ground for the next several days. Miles of dense forest stretched in every direction, broken only by occasional clearings and the snaking path of a river that wound its way through the landscape. As they approached the drop zone, the helicopter's crew chief signaled that it was time to prepare for fast rope insertion. Sarah felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with the beginning of any challenging mission. She had trained for situations like this countless times, but the combination of physical demands and mental pressure never failed to get her heart racing. The insertion went smoothly, with all 3 team members touching down safely in a small clearing surrounded by towering pine trees. The helicopter disappeared quickly, leaving them alone in the wilderness with nothing but their training, their equipment, and their trust in each other. Rodriguez immediately began setting up his communications equipment, while Park conducted a quick perimeter check to ensure they hadn't been spotted during the insertion. Sarah studied her map and compass, plotting their route to the first checkpoint where they would need to establish contact with base camp. The forest was alive with sounds, birds calling from the canopy above, the rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush, and the distant sound of running water that indicated the proximity of the river they had spotted from the air. Sarah had always found something peaceful about being in nature, even during intense training exercises like this one. However, that peace was short-lived. Less than an hour after their insertion, Rodriguez picked up radio chatter indicating that opposing forces were already actively searching for their team. The exercise controllers had wasted no time in deploying hunter teams whose job was to track down and capture the participants. Sarah made the decision to alter their planned route, leading her team deeper into the forest, where the thick canopy would provide better concealment from any aerial surveillance. They moved in single file with Park taking point as the team medic, Sarah in the middle as team leader, and Rodriguez bringing up the rear while monitoring communications. The terrain proved more challenging than the maps had indicated. What appeared to be gentle slopes on paper turned out to be steep ravines filled with loose rocks and fallen trees. The team's progress slowed considerably as they carefully navigated around these obstacles while maintaining noise discipline. As the afternoon wore on, it became clear that the opposing forces were closing in on their position. Rodriguez reported hearing helicopter activity in the distance, and Park spotted what appeared to be ground team movements through the trees several hundred meters to their east. The pressure was building, just as the exercise designers had intended. Sarah knew they needed to find a defensible position where they could set up their communications equipment and complete their first objective. She spotted a small hill crowned with a cluster of large boulders that would provide both concealment and good sight lines in all directions. The climb to the hilltop required careful movement to avoid dislodging loose stones that might give away their position. Once they reached the summit, Rodriguez quickly began assembling his radio equipment while Park and Sarah established a defensive perimeter. The view from their elevated position revealed both good news and bad news. The good news was that they had an excellent vantage point for spotting any approaching hostile forces. The bad news was that they could see dust clouds in the distance that indicated multiple vehicle patrols searching the area systematically. Rodriguez worked frantically to establish communications with base camp, but something was interfering with his equipment. Whether it was the terrain, enemy jamming, or simply equipment failure, he couldn't maintain a stable connection for more than a few seconds at a time. As the sun began to set, casting the forest in deep shadows, Sarah realized they were facing a difficult decision. They could remain in their current position and continue trying to establish communications, but doing so would make them sitting targets for the opposing forces that were clearly converging on their area. Alternatively, they could abandon their current mission and try to evade capture, but that would mean failing their first objective. The sound of approaching helicopters grew louder, and Sarah could see searchlights beginning to sweep the forest floor below their position. The hunter teams were using every tool at their disposal to flush out the participants, just as enemy forces would in a real combat situation. Park crawled over to Sarah's position and whispered urgently that she had spotted ground forces approaching from two different directions. They were effectively being surrounded, with less than an hour of daylight remaining to either complete their mission or find a way to escape the closing net. Rodriguez finally managed to establish brief contact with base camp, just long enough to transmit their position and status before the connection failed again. Sarah wasn't sure if the message had been received clearly, but it was the best they could do under the circumstances. As darkness fell completely, the team found themselves in an increasingly precarious situation. The opposing forces had night vision equipment and superior numbers, while Sarah's team had only their training, their teamwork, and their determination to succeed against overwhelming odds. The distant sound of helicopters continued to echo through the forest, and Sarah couldn't help but wonder if one of those aircraft might be piloted by her husband Marcus. The thought both comforted and worried her. Comforted because she knew his skills as a pilot were exceptional, but worried because if he was participating in the hunter team operations, he would be just as determined to complete his mission as she was to complete hers. Little did she know that events were already in motion that would test not only her training and skills, but also the bonds of trust and love that connected her to her fellow soldiers and her family. The second day of the exercise began before dawn, with the distant rumble of helicopter rotors cutting through the morning mist. Sarah's team had managed to evade capture through the night by constantly moving through the dense forest, but they were exhausted and running low on water. Their first objective had been only partially completed, and now they faced an even more challenging task. Master Sergeant Williams had designed the second phase to test participants under extreme stress. Each team would receive new coordinates via encrypted radio transmission, leading them to a simulated crash site where they would need to extract vital intelligence while under heavy pressure from opposing forces. Rodriguez finally managed to receive their new orders through his rebuilt radio array. The crash site was located in a steep ravine approximately 3 miles from their current position, but the route would take them through an area where hunter teams had established multiple checkpoints. Park studied her medical supplies and expressed concern about one of the team members from another unit whom they had encountered briefly during the night. The soldier appeared to be suffering from dehydration and exhaustion, but military protocol in the exercise required teams to complete their individual missions rather than rendering assistance to other participants. Sarah wrestled with this dilemma as they broke camp and began moving toward their new objective. The exercise was designed to simulate real combat conditions where difficult decisions had to be made under pressure, but her instincts, as both a soldier and a human being, made it hard to simply ignore someone who might need help. The morning march through the forest proved even more treacherous than the previous day's movement. Recent rainfall had made the ground slippery and unstable, and the team's progress slowed to a crawl as they navigated around fallen trees and washed-out sections of the terrain. Approximately 2 hours into their movement, Rodriguez picked up radio chatter indicating that one of the other participating teams had activated an emergency beacon. This meant that someone had been injured seriously enough that the exercise controllers needed to extract them for real medical treatment. The knowledge that actual danger existed alongside the simulated threats added another layer of tension to an already stressful situation. Sarah decided to alter their route once again, this time heading toward higher ground where they might be able to observe the crash site from a distance before committing to the dangerous descent into the ravine. The decision proved wise when they reached a ridgeline that offered an excellent view of their objective area. Through binoculars, Sarah could see that the simulated crash site was actually an elaborate setup involving a damaged helicopter fuselage, scattered debris, and what appeared to be several mannequins representing casualties. However, she could also see that opposing forces had established positions around the entire area, making any approach extremely dangerous. Park counted at least 6 different hunter team positions, each equipped with mock weapons and communication equipment. The exercise controllers had clearly anticipated that teams would try to approach from the high ground and had positioned their forces accordingly. Rodriguez reported that his radio was picking up increasing amounts of encrypted traffic, suggesting that multiple hunter teams were coordinating their efforts to capture the remaining participants. The net was tightening, and Sarah realized they would need to act quickly if they hoped to complete their mission successfully. The descent into the ravine required careful planning and precise execution. Sarah decided to split her team temporarily, with Park remaining on the ridgeline as an observer and communications relay while she and Rodriguez made the dangerous approach to the crash site. The slope was steeper than it had appeared from above, and loose rocks made every step treacherous. Sarah found herself sliding several feet at a time, fighting to maintain control while trying to move quietly enough to avoid detection by the hunter teams positioned throughout the area. Rodriguez followed approximately 20 meters behind, carefully monitoring their communications while documenting their approach route in case they needed to retreat quickly. His experience in urban combat environments proved valuable as he identified the best concealment opportunities along their path. When they reached the valley floor, Sarah could see that the crash site was even more elaborate than it had appeared from above. The helicopter fuselage showed realistic battle damage, and the scattered debris field extended over several hundred meters. Hidden somewhere among the wreckage would be the intelligence materials they needed to recover. However, as they began their approach to the debris field, Sarah noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. The helicopter fuselage bore the markings and configuration of Marcus's squadron. While she knew this was just a training exercise using decommissioned equipment, seeing anything that resembled her husband's aircraft in a crash scenario brought up emotions she hadn't expected to face. Rodriguez moved systematically through the outer debris field, searching for anything that might contain the intelligence materials they needed to recover. The exercise controllers had hidden their objective well, requiring the teams to actually search through realistic crash debris rather than simply locating an obviously placed container. As they worked, Park's voice crackled through their radio headsets with an urgent warning. She had spotted movement from multiple hunter team positions, and it appeared that their presence in the ravine had been detected. They had perhaps 10 minutes before opposing forces would converge on their location. Sarah intensified her search through the helicopter's cabin area, looking for anything that might be their objective. The realism of the setup was both impressive and disturbing. The mannequins representing casualties had been positioned with care to simulate actual combat injuries, and personal effects scattered throughout the cabin made the scenario feel uncomfortably real. Finally, Rodriguez called out that he had located what appeared to be a sealed document case wedged beneath a section of twisted metal. However, extracting it would require moving several pieces of heavy debris, a task that would take precious time they might not have. Working together, Sarah and Rodriguez managed to shift enough wreckage to access the document case. Inside, they found encrypted materials along with new coordinates for their next objective. However, as they prepared to leave the crash site, the sound of approaching vehicles echoed through the ravine. Park's voice came through their radios with increasing urgency. Multiple hunter teams were moving into the ravine from different directions, and their escape route back up the slope they had descended was now blocked by at least one team of opposing forces. Sarah assessed their options quickly. They could try to fight their way out using the mock combat protocols of the exercise, but they would be outnumbered by at least 3-1. Alternatively, they could try to find another escape route through the ravine, but doing so would mean moving away from Park's position and potentially separating their team permanently. As they moved through the debris field trying to avoid detection, Rodriguez stumbled over a piece of concealed wreckage and fell heavily to the ground. The impact was loud enough to alert nearby hunter teams to their exact position, and within seconds Sarah could hear voices calling out their location to other opposing forces. Rodriguez had injured his ankle in the fall and was having difficulty moving quickly. Park reported that she could see hunter teams converging on the crash site from multiple directions and estimated they had less than 5 minutes before being completely surrounded. In desperation, Sarah began looking for any kind of defensive position where they might be able to hold out until darkness provided better concealment for an escape attempt. The helicopter fuselage offered some protection, but it would also trap them in a position where they could be easily surrounded. Rodriguez, despite his injured ankle, suggested they try to reach a cluster of large boulders approximately 50 meters from the crash site. The rocks would provide better defensive positions and multiple escape routes, but reaching them would require crossing open ground while under observation from hunter teams positioned on the ridgeline above. As they prepared to make their desperate dash across the open ground, the sound of helicopter rotors suddenly filled the air above the ravine. Sarah looked up to see a military helicopter approaching at high speed, flying lower than any aircraft should safely operate in such terrain. For a moment, she wondered if this was part of the exercise scenario, perhaps aerial hunter teams joining the operation to capture remaining participants. However, something about the helicopter's approach seemed different from the other aircraft they had encountered during the training exercise. The helicopter settled into a hover directly above the crash site, despite the dangerous flying conditions created by the steep ravine walls and swirling wind currents. Sarah could see the pilot through the aircraft's windscreen, and her heart stopped as she recognized the familiar silhouette and flight helmet. Marcus had somehow located their position and was preparing to extract them from an increasingly desperate situation. But how had he known where to find them? And was his intervention within the rules of the training exercise, or had he broken protocol to help his wife and her team? As the helicopter descended toward the valley floor, Sarah realized that the next few minutes would determine not only whether they successfully completed their mission, but also whether her husband's career would be damaged by his decision to mount what appeared to be an unauthorized rescue operation. The helicopter's approach created a whirlwind of debris and dust throughout the ravine, forcing both Sarah's team and the approaching hunter teams to take cover. Through her radio headset, Sarah could hear Marcus's voice cutting through the exercise communications with an emergency override code that immediately caught everyone's attention. What Sarah didn't know was that Marcus had been monitoring exercise communications from his position with the aerial support squadron when Rodriguez's partial transmission from the previous evening had been received by base camp. The message had been garbled and incomplete, but it contained coordinates that appeared to indicate a team in serious distress. Exercise controllers had initially dismissed the transmission as part of the normal training scenario, but Marcus had recognized something in the fragmented message that concerned him. Years of marriage had taught him to pick up on subtle cues in Sarah's behavior, and even through the distorted radio transmission, he had sensed that something was genuinely wrong. Against standing orders, Marcus had requested permission to conduct an aerial reconnaissance mission over the training area. When that request was denied, he had made a decision that could potentially end his military career. He had taken his helicopter and launched an unauthorized search and rescue mission. Using his knowledge of Sarah's training and tactical preferences, Marcus had systematically searched areas where he believed her team was most likely to establish positions. The crash site scenario had been added to the exercise at the last minute, and Marcus suspected that Sarah's team might have encountered unexpected complications while attempting to complete their objectives. As his helicopter descended into the ravine, Marcus could see that the situation on the ground was more serious than anyone had realized. Through his aircraft's communication system, he was receiving reports that Rodriguez had suffered what appeared to be a significant injury, and that all 3 team members were showing signs of severe exhaustion and dehydration. The hunter teams that had been pursuing Sarah's group were actually composed of experienced instructors whose job was to provide realistic opposition during the exercise. However, when they saw Marcus's helicopter approaching the crash site, they immediately recognized that something had gone beyond the normal parameters of the training scenario. Master Sergeant Williams, who was coordinating the exercise from base camp, initially assumed that Marcus's helicopter was part of a planned aerial extraction that hadn't been properly communicated through the chain of command. It wasn't until he tried to contact Marcus through normal channels that he realized the pilot was operating completely outside the exercise protocol. Meanwhile, Sarah found herself facing an impossible choice. Her training told her to complete the mission and maintain the integrity of the exercise, but her instincts as Rodriguez's team leader told her that his injury might be more serious than initially apparent. Additionally, all 3 team members were reaching the limits of their physical endurance after more than 36 hours in the field with minimal food and water. As Marcus's helicopter touched down in the narrow confines of the ravine, Sarah made her decision. She signaled to Park to provide covering fire simulation while she helped Rodriguez move toward the aircraft. The hunter teams, recognizing that a real medical situation might be developing, held their positions rather than continuing their pursuit. Marcus had landed his helicopter in an extremely challenging location that demonstrated both his skill as a pilot and his determination to extract his wife's team regardless of the personal risk involved. The ravine was barely wide enough to accommodate the aircraft's rotor diameter, and wind currents created by the terrain made the landing exceptionally dangerous. As Sarah and Park helped Rodriguez toward the helicopter, Marcus emerged from the pilot's seat to assist with loading the injured soldier. It was the first time the couple had seen each other since the beginning of the exercise, and the emotional reunion was complicated by the serious nature of their situation. Rodriguez's ankle injury proved to be more severe than initially thought. What had appeared to be a simple sprain was actually a fracture that required immediate medical attention. The combination of the injury, exhaustion, and dehydration meant that continuing the exercise could have resulted in serious long-term health consequences. However, as Marcus prepared to lift off with the extracted team, exercise controllers faced a difficult decision. The training scenario had been disrupted by what appeared to be an unauthorized rescue mission, but the rescue itself had been necessary due to legitimate medical concerns that hadn't been properly communicated through official channels. Master Sergeant Williams arrived at the crash site in another helicopter just as Marcus was preparing to depart with Sarah's team. Instead of ordering Marcus to remain on the ground pending disciplinary action, Williams made a command decision that would later be debated throughout the military training community. Rather than treating Marcus's intervention as a violation of exercise protocol, Williams declared it to be an unscheduled test of the entire system's ability to respond to real emergencies that might develop during training exercises. Marcus's ability to recognize subtle signs of distress in incomplete radio transmissions, his initiative in launching a search and rescue mission, and his piloting skills in conducting the extraction were all cited as examples of the kind of quick thinking and decisive action that the military needed to encourage rather than punish. The extraction itself became a case study that was later incorporated into training programs throughout the military. Marcus's helicopter flight back to base camp was documented and analyzed to help other pilots understand the techniques required for operating in extremely confined terrain under emergency conditions. For Sarah's team, the experience became a powerful lesson in the importance of clear communication, situational awareness, and the bonds of trust that connect military personnel both in training and in combat. Rodriguez's injury healed completely, and he later credited Sarah's leadership and Marcus's intervention with preventing what could have been a career-ending medical emergency. The aftermath of the incident also highlighted the complex relationships that exist within military families where both spouses serve in demanding roles. Sarah and Marcus had to navigate questions about whether personal relationships had influenced professional decisions, and whether their ability to serve effectively might be compromised by their emotional connections to each other. Exercise controllers ultimately concluded that the incident had actually enhanced the training value of the entire program. Participants learned valuable lessons about leadership under pressure, the importance of accurate communication during emergencies, and the need for military systems to maintain flexibility when unexpected situations develop. The story of the extraction spread throughout the military community not as an example of protocol violation, but as a demonstration of the core values that military training is designed to instill: initiative, courage, loyalty, and the willingness to take calculated risks to protect fellow service members were all qualities that the military wanted to encourage. 6 months later, Marcus received a commendation for his actions during the training exercise, and the incident was officially classified as an innovative training evolution rather than a disciplinary matter. Sarah's team was credited with successfully completing their mission objectives under extremely challenging conditions. The experience also strengthened the marriage between Sarah and Marcus in ways they hadn't expected. Seeing each other perform under extreme pressure had reinforced their mutual respect and admiration, while the professional recognition they both received validated their decision to build careers in military service. Years later, when they told the story to young officers and cadets, both Sarah and Marcus emphasized the importance of trusting your instincts, maintaining situational awareness, and never hesitating to take action when the safety of fellow service members is at stake. The incident had become more than just a training exercise. It had become a defining moment that illustrated the best qualities of military service and the unbreakable bonds that connect those who serve their country with honor and distinction. The ravine where the extraction took place was later designated as a permanent training site, with a small plaque commemorating the incident. The plaque read simply, "In recognition of initiative, courage, and the bonds of service that unite all who wear the uniform." It served as a reminder to future generations of military personnel that sometimes the most important lessons come not from planned training exercises, but from the unexpected moments when ordinary people are called upon to demonstrate extraordinary courage and commitment to their fellow service members.